Welcome everybody. I'm excited about this message. I just wanted to, even though Brian may seem like he's gone, he's actually not. So this is his message, and I get the honor of sharing this with you. Last week we were, not last week, we were on Zoom. The conversation around fear, like why are we supposed to be afraid, and is God an angry God? Why would God be an angry God? And so Brian did some research and came up with this for why is God an angry God? And for me, growing up, when I first I didn't really start to get into the Bible until I was an adult. I never understood God as an angry God, and it actually, for me, it was difficult to get the full gist of the message, because that was like hanging over. And it's just that for me it's just a lack of understanding. And I think when you actually go in and read, if you read the entire chapter, or look at the just before it says God was angry, and then really read after that, I think you'll find a completely different answer. So let me get started. Slow to anger. So, last time we had a Zoom Bible study, and we had a lot of discussion about Psalm 103.8 and what it means to each of us. Psalm 103 verse 8 is, "The Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love." One character trait of God that was brought up and discussed at length was slow to anger. What does this mean? How can we, as followers of Christ who love God, understand what this character trait really means? Clearly, the passage in Psalm 103:8 is saying that God is slow to anger. And if he is slow to anger, that means there's a point where he can get angry. Most of us probably know someone who has a short fuse. It can be really uncomfortable, and we might also know a person who seems to be calm and collected. But boy, oh boy, don't set that person off, because there are serious consequences when they get angry. Do you want to be around people who get angry? No. Do you want to be associated with angry people at all? Probably not, because you may not know when they will explode in anger and who it might be directed at. As we work through this study, think about how you perceive yourself. Do you think you are slow to anger? How about others? Would they describe you as someone who gets angry fast, or do they see you as someone who is slow to anger? So in our modern culture context, there are two important ideas associated with the emotion of anger, one positive and one negative. Anger as protection. Anger is a physical response our bodies generate when something we value is threatened, compromised, or lost. There is almost always a deeper feeling or value at stake that generates an angry response. Like, I think that I would be angry if someone were to hurt my child or bully my child. Anger as abuse. Anger is a sign of losing self-control, and when it's expressed by someone in a position of power, it can be used to bully, threaten, and intimidate subordinates into compliance and submission. Anger as protection and anger as abuse are primarily psychological and sociological perspectives on anger. They have deeply influenced not only in the way we talk about anger, but also the way we conceive of anger and how we evaluate it. I just want to stop right there and before I read on and just say, we never really know what has happened to someone. why they are the way they are. We may never really know the hurt that someone may have felt. You know, like when someone does something, they take away a piece of you and you walk around with that. And that, being on either side of that can be painful. And that we, as Christians, it just goes back to being merciful. As Pastor Chuck would say, is like, are we merciful? So let me read on. When we come to the Bible, how we react to God's anger will not only depend on our own life experience and our core beliefs about God's character, but it will also depend on our disposition to the Christian faith in general. What I mean by this is, are we open-minded about the Christian faith? Are we faith-friendly? Are we a skeptic? Are hostile to the Christian faith? For example, if I think of God as a distant, all-powerful sovereign, then his anger will seem more like a dangerous, volatile expression of a deeply angry being. But if I think of God as a generous, creative Father, then his anger will seem measured, fair, and a reasonable expression of his justice and fairness. So what we need to do, as we have done time and time again, is to set aside our preconceived ideas or our judgments about if God is an angry God or not. To truly understand this slow to anger character trait of God, we really need to trace the development of God's anger through the storyline of the Bible. Let's start by getting a basic understanding of slow to anger from a Hebrew perspective. And since I didn't write this, but Brian did. Since I'm in the seminary, we are going to get a bit academic here. The Hebrew phrase for slow to anger is Erek Epeim. So it's like Eric Epeim. And it has been translated in various ways throughout history of English translators. Let's take a look at a few translations of Erek Epeim. It means slow to anger, long-suffering, patient, loath to be angry. But the literal translation of this phrase, Erek Epeim, is actually long of nose or long of nostrils, where the word nose equates, where does the word nose equates to angry? So the big question remains, why is long of nostrils a figure of speech associated with anger? A common Hebrew phrase that means to become angry is his nose has become hot. This phrase appears 56 times in the Hebrew Bible. Let's take a look at a few of them. 1 Samuel 17:28. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger burned. Literally, his nose was hot against David, and he said, "Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those sheep in the wilderness?" In Genesis 39:19, now when Joseph's master, Potiphar, heard the words of his wife, which she spoke to him, saying, "This is what your slave did to me," his anger burned. Literally, his nose burned. In Jonah 3, verse 8 and 9, "But let people and animals be covered with a sackcloth. Let everyone call urgently on God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. Who knows? God may yet relent with compassion and turn from his fierce anger, so that we will not perish." Now, some people may know of those chapters and may not, but let's keep moving forward, and I think we'll get a little better understanding. The words heat and nose can also be used separately because both are figures of speech for hot anger. Ezra 8:22. "The gracious hand of our God is on everyone who looks to him, but his great anger is against all who forsake him. In Psalm 2, verse 4 through 6, the one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. He rebukes them in his anger, literally knows, and terrifies them in his wrath, literally heat, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. There are multiple Hebrew words that can stand on their own as words for hot anger, or just anger. Here's an example of a word that means angry or to be angry. Quatsath, cuts off. Esther, in chapter 1, verse 12. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. Then the king became very angry. Quatsath, cuts off, and his wrath burned within him. God's hot anger and wrath in the Bible are a major reason why people struggle to read the Bible. And I don't know if that's anybody else's experiences, but it was mine. These words are fairly common in the Hebrew Bible, and they depict God in ways that make many people uncomfortable. Numbers 11, verse 1. Now the people complained about their hardships in the hearing of the Lord. When he heard them, his anger burned hot. Then fire from the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 14 and 15. Do not follow other gods, the gods of the peoples around you. For the Lord your God, who is among you, is a jealous God, and his anger will burn against you, and he will destroy you from the face of the land. When these types of statements are taken out of the immediate context and read independently of the larger biblical storyline, they can be used to create a portrait of God that is imbalanced and distorted. If you were to simply list all of these statements about God's hot wrath and read them aloud, the words of Exodus 34:6 and Psalm 103:8 can sound hollow. The Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. We need to appreciate these metaphorical descriptions of divine anger and understand the reality to which they point. The intense emotion God experiences when his covenant people betray him and embrace their own self-destruction. Critics of the Bible often complain that the God we see depicted in the Old Testament is an angry, vindictive deity. They see God as temperamental and seems to ready to fly off the handle and smite people in judgment. They point to episodes like the flood or the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and declare God to be a genocidal tyrant. And they respond to this angry, judging God by getting angry themselves and judging the Bible to be unworthy of their time or their belief. Other readers accept the Bible as an important, even sacred text, but they too have difficulty accepting what the Old Testament says about God. So they turn a blind eye to the violence in the Bible, accepting it all at face value. So just my experience, I'm going to stop there for a second, is that when I started reading the Bible, I started from page 1. And I read the Old Testament and didn't understand hardly any of it. And then I went to the New Testament and would rarely go back because it was hard to understand, and it seemed like there was a lot of bloodshed and a lot of wrath, and it's like, what's going on here? So that's just my experience. I don't think any of these is the right way to approach the difficult depictions of God as we read about in the Old Testament. Rather than to dismiss them out of hand and even simply accept that God is angry and says that's fine because he's God, I think the best response, the most faithful response, is to take a closer look at the text of the Old Testament to determine if perhaps we read something into it that isn't there. Perhaps we unknowingly make God out to be far more easily angered and more wrathful than he actually is. After all, if you search specifically for the places in the Old Testament where God is explicitly described as being angry, you might be surprised to discover that they're actually not as common as you may think. We're going to take a look at a few of the biblical stories people often point to as the evidence of God's explosive temper or terrible wrath. But what you will notice is that they actually contain no mention of God being angry. Let's start near the beginning, when Adam and Eve sinned. When God comes into the garden, they hide from him because they were ashamed and afraid. So what did God do? Let's read from Genesis 3. Genesis 3, 21, 22. And the Lord God made for Adam and for his wife garments of skins and clothed them. Then the Lord said, Behold, the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil. Now, lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. God shows Adam and Eve severe mercy by placing them outside the garden, which protects both humans from themselves while assigning them to the consequences of their action. Notice that God's judgment is not accompanied here by anger. Rather, it comes along with God's tender care to provide clothing for the humans. Most likely, we all know the story of how Cain killed his brother Abel out of jealousy. In Genesis chapter 4, verse 9 and 10, then the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel, your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. Murder was a capital crime for the biblical authors. Yet here is God dealing mercifully with the first murderer. Instead of executing him, God sends Cain out into the realm of exile and mortality, assigning him to the consequences of his decision. And because Cain was afraid for his life, God promised him that he would protect Cain. In the case of the flood account, we are told that, in fact, God was sorrowful, grieved at how wicked humanity had become, and that he acted out of moral necessity rather than anger. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 14 and 15, then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. God's decision to bring the flood was interconnected with the disaster that humans are themselves, choosing and perpetuating in the land. None of the above passages mentions divine anger. Rather, the first emotion God feels in the Bible is grief and sorrow, not anger. When we get the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, Scripture says in Genesis 18, verse 20 through 33, that God judged the cities only because of the massive injustice and perversion of social order taking place there. Only after thorough deliberation and careful evaluation determined if judgment was truly necessary. Only on the condition that the overwhelming majority of the population truly deserved it. As a matter of fact, Abraham begged God to not destroy the city where his nephew Lot lived. He started out by asking God to save the city if 50 righteous people were found. Then bargained with God all the way down to 10 righteous people. Genesis 18, verse 32, then he said, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again, but this once. Suppose 10 are found there. And he answered, This is God answering him. For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. In other words, the Bible practically takes pain to spell out for us that God did not judge out of anger or impulse, but from a concern for justice and order in his creation. So when does God get angry in the Bible? Interesting. The 54th chapter of the Bible is the very first place where it mentions God becoming angry, and his anger is directed at Moses. God made it absolutely clear that what he wanted Moses to do, but Moses makes excuse after excuse for not doing it, to the point where he sounds insolent to God. Exodus 4:14, then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. If you continue reading that verse, you will see that God's anger doesn't lead to punishment. He actually provides an accommodation that addresses Moses' trepidation. God doesn't fly off the handle or respond in a fickle manner. God stays patient with his stubborn human messenger. Keep in mind that all of these events happened long before Moses angered God. So the first mention of God's anger is in the context of an interpersonal relationship where emotional give and take is part of the expected dynamic. But what is interesting is that it is followed not by immediate wrath, but by his grace. God's grace is love. When we get to the story of the golden calf, we really see the fury of God because his people betray him moments after they make their covenant with God. Moses was with God, and he was delayed returning from Mount Sinai. And instead of remembering all that God had done for them, and they fashioned a golden calf from their golden earrings. In Exodus 32, verse 7 through 10, and the Lord said to Moses, go down, for your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen these people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them in order that I may make a great nation out of you. So God is actually thinking of the nation of Israel, of the people that are to come. This passage is not Israel's foundational fail narrative, which shows exactly why God's anger gets hot. God is angered by betrayal and covenant violation. God being slow to anger means that he won't become angry for just any reason. His anger is aroused by specific acts of betrayal from his covenant people. This is important here. What you will notice that God's anger became much more frequent after he entered into a covenant partnership with Israel. There are situations, especially in a deeply committed covenant. Oh, by the way, before I read more, that covenant still stands today. God doesn't go back on his word. There are situations, especially in a deeply committed covenant relationship built on trust and mutual faithfulness, where disloyalty and rebellion should provoke a proper response of anger. This is exactly how the Bible presents God. He is not a passive, impersonal, distant force. He is a personal creator who enters into a relationship with people. And such relationships can and will entail emotional responses, which include anger. What is interesting is when you look at the laws that God gave the Israelites, there is only one that makes a reference to God's anger. And we will find it in Exodus 22, verse 22 to 24. This is, for me, this is so true. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them, and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. So that says a lot inside of that. Is like, that is the one thing God says he doesn't want to see. Oppression of the powerless is the one instance among all the laws that is said to provoke God's anger. God's anger and judgment are developed throughout the Old Testament, and we continue to see God's anger and judgment as a response to the betrayal of his covenant people. The ultimate expression of God's anger in the Torah and the prophets is the exile of his people to Babylon. After centuries of covenant betrayal and violation, God is handing Israel over to Babylon, who is described as the cup of Yahweh's anger, God's anger. This is key. Being handed over to Babylonian captivity is the result of God's just anger. But the prophets anticipated a time after the Babylonian exile when God's anger will have fulfilled its purpose, or his justice, because of the covenant betrayal. When we get to the New Testament, John the Baptist's message to the religious people was about the wrath to come, which we find in Matthew chapter 3, 1 through 12. Let's read verse 7. But when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to his baptism, he said to them, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come?" When John sees the leaders of Jerusalem approach him, he begins talking about a coming act of divine judgment. This connection is crucial. He's not talking about the afterlife here. Rather, he is standing in the tradition of Israel's prophets, calling the leaders of Israel, here represented by Jerusalem, to account. He is warning them that the destruction of the city is near unless they respond to the one who is to come after me. We're not going to get into it today, but all of John's imagery of divine judgment is drawn from the Hebrew Bible. Now, when Jesus came onto the scene announcing the arrival of God's kingdom, part of his announcement was warning about the coming destruction of Jerusalem. Much like the Old Testament prophets, Jesus warned of God's coming judgment if Israel did not accept his offer of the kingdom. Jesus' focus was more on the generosity of Israel's God and his inclusion, regathering of the poor and lost sheep of Israel. This was good news, but we should not see this positive aspect of Jesus' announcement as being in tension with his announcements of judgment on Jerusalem. They are both part of the message about God's kingdom. As we come to a close, I want us to really understand what it means when we read that God is slow to anger. Many times in the Bible, we can cite the incidences where God was disappointed and angry with mankind. But each time we see his mercy on us. He gave us the opportunity to rejoin him as he willingly upheld his covenant with man. But eventually, God's wrath had to be unleashed for the punishment of sin. Throughout the Bible, we read about God getting angry, but he withheld his full wrath and only unleashed a small portion of his wrath. Throughout the Bible, we see time and time again where God shows us mercy. Yes, there are a lot of uncomfortable stories in the Bible that we, as modern readers, have difficulty understanding. One thing is certain, there is no Bible study where the full wrath of God's fury was cast upon man until Jesus was hung on the cross. We can't comprehend what Jesus went through. If you think that the scourging of Jesus by Romans was brutal, it was. If you think that the suffocating death on the cross was brutal, it was. But there is nothing that can help us to comprehend the wrath of God that Jesus took upon himself willingly. Jesus was the one who took the full wrath that was meant for you and me. Jesus knew what that wrath would look like as he was sweating blood in the Garden of Gethsemane, asking the Father if there was any other way. But he knew there was only one, that he was the only one who could bear the wrath of God on man's behalf, and he willingly took the full fury of God's wrath. I just want to stop there for 1 second, and it shows the human side of God, of Jesus, that he knew what was coming, and he's like, God, is there any other way? Is there any other way that we can do this? Knowing that he had to do it, he still asked God. So when you think about how God is slow to anger, just think about how man constantly falls short, and how God took his wrath meant for man and placed it all on Jesus as Jesus suffered on the cross. Amen. I just want to take a second to go back and read a little bit of a breakdown of 103, verse 6 through 8. First, David recalled the Lord's covenant with Moses. After a word of praise for the Lord's righteousness, David said that God revealed himself to Moses and Moses' people as a compassionate and gracious God, who is therefore slow to anger and abounds in covenant loyalty, as love for the people of Israel, is based on God's words to Moses on Mount Sinai. Because of these attributes, God is faithful to his people and will deliver them from oppression. David then explained that the Lord mercifully forgives sins because God is slow to anger. He does not always accuse, bring a court case against man, or a man of sin, nor deal with him accordingly to his sins. So if God dealt with us according to our sins, there would be wrath all over the place. And because of his great love, this is important, he completely separates sins from the sinners by forgiving them. That doesn't sound to me like someone who is going to bring down wrath. He's always thinking of us. So I don't know if if you can walk away from this with a different understanding without reading some of these verses. And if you read just before and after, I think you get a real appreciation for God's love. That's something that I'm learning, is that the deepness of his words all lead back to love.